Shehakol niyeh b'dvarei. L'chaim, l'chaim l'bracha. Good Tavach, Shavua Tov. A good week to one and all. Start off our week. Torah studies, of course. And important question. What does freedom mean to you? What does freedom mean to you? Tell me if this fits in your definition. This is Webster's dictionary. Webster's dictionary says freedom is the power, the right, or the state of acting, speaking, or thinking without restrictions, coercion, or imprisonment. It signifies autonomy, independence, and the absence of limiting constraints, allowing individuals to make their own choices. Key examples include freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of press, and so on. Anybody agree? Say aye. Anybody disagree? Say aye. Is that your definition of freedom?
I didn't hear, but it's Webster's. Has
aspects of freedom.
So what is freedom? What is true freedom? Let us understand. Okay, so we're going to discuss an interesting combination from the Passover Seder. Matzah and charoisis. Charoisis, matzah, we all know what matzah is, of course, unleavened bread. Charoisis is something that's made from, well, there's different customs of how you make it. The Ashkenazic is from apples, from an apple, pears, nuts, and please have some nuts. No apples and pears tonight, sorry. Just and a little wine poured into it. And that's what you make it from. You grind it up. And there's a custom that says that you actually put the two things together. And it's required by Jewish law at every Seder. Let's take a look. Okay. Here we have. From the Torah, it says, Rabbi Amram wrote, one should recite Hamotzi, blessing, then dip matzah in charoisis and eat. Maimonides encoded this rule, right? You make the Hamotzi on the matzah and you dip it into charoisis. I don't understand the reason for this dipping. He says, Rabbi Avram, the son of Natan, who authored the Manhig, he asked, if matzah represents liberation and charoisis represents mortar, how can they be combined? So why do we have the charoisis? Because when you look at it, it looks like mortar. What was the mortar? Right? Mortar represented the bondage and the suffering of the Jewish people, that they had to make their own mortar, right? Now, let's back up for a second. Don't we have something else that also represents our bondage? Sorry?
it also represents something else about our bondage?
No, the charoisis represents the mortar,
Yeah.
right? But we have something else by the Seder plate. What's that? Bitter herbs. The bitterness that we endured in the times of being in Egypt, right? Let's take a look over here. I think I have the wrong one here. Okay, well, let's look over here. We have matzah that represents liberation. Morah represents suffering. And charoisis represents also suffering. Okay? Why do we eat bitter herbs? We say this in the Haggadah because the Egyptians embittered our lives of our ancestors in Egypt, right? Charaisis, though, is also the bitterness, but as we mentioned, this is a general embitterment of the lives of the Jewish people in Egypt. But Charaisis is a specific, as Moses famously complained to God, "You have harmed this nation." Our sages explained in the Haggadah that this is a reference to the mortar. For when the Jewish people ran short of mortar to make bricks, the Egyptians ground Jewish babies into powder and used them to filler for the mortar. Ooh, that's right. So, if you recall the story, in the first Torah portion of Shmois, in the book of Exodus, God chooses Moses as the redeemer of the Jewish people, and he comes. And what happens when he comes? Things get worse. Oh, obviously the Jewish people are lazy people, says Pharaoh. So they are going to have to now make their own mortar, find their own straw to make the mortar. It's not going to be provided for them anymore in order to build. Right? So they went and made their own mortar, but eventually they ran out. They couldn't have, and this is what the Egyptians did, right? Ooh, that's a pretty heavy-duty dream. A pretty heavy-duty thing that happened to Jewish people, right? And of course, why does Pharaoh say that? Because what did Moses come and say to them? Let my people go, right? In other words, freedom for the Jewish people. Oh, you want freedom? So we're going to burden you even more, right? So the charaisis represents something much more unspeakable, right? Usually we don't mention about what was done, how the mortar was made at the end, right? Which then of course, the question comes, as was brought down by the manhig, is how could you take the charaisis and spread it over the matzah? It doesn't fit. Matzah is liberation. And this is charaisis. It represents something so evil and so unthinkable and so unimaginably painful. How do the two come together? And the truth is, even the charaisis itself is something we need to understand. Because charaisis in the end was sweet. Pears, apples, and nuts. And the nuts might be a little bitter, but with pears and apples, and it's a nice mixture. That's the Ashkenazic. The Sephardic custom is to put dates in there, so it's really sweet. How do you make sweet mortar exactly? Right? How is mortar sweet? What does that mean? Right? And of course, when we're speaking about matzah, as we all know, it represents liberation, right? Why do we eat matzah? We say in the Haggadah, because our ancestors had no time to let the dough rise before the King of Kings, the Holy One, blessed be He, revealed Himself to them and redeemed them, right? So, we brought earlier the manhig, his teacher was the Ravid. The Ravid writes that Avram said that this is nonsense. Once again, Maimonides failed to identify a reason for his ruling. Right? He says you have matzah with the charaisis. He's questioning. Where does he get that from? Thematically, they don't fit. Right? The truth is that over the last few centuries, many of our teachers of blessed memory believe that matzah, over which we recite the hamotzi blessing, should not be dipped in charaisis, and this is a prevailing custom. So Rabbi Avram, the Ravid, strongly disagrees with Maimonides. Right?
Sorry, when it says, and this is the prevailing custom, Right now, the custom is not to dip it.
We don't dip it.
Don't dip it.
We're talking about the matzah.
Oh, yeah.
We dip the bitter herbs in charoisis. Right, that we do. But not the matzah.
That's
We're
why
speaking
don't
about the
dip it.
matzah. We're only speaking of the matzah here. We're not speaking about the bitter herbs. That is dipped in charoisis, huh?
We don't dip it outside anything.
Right, we don't, right. Aside from the fact that the Chabad custom is not to make matzah wet, damp, with any, that it shouldn't touch anything because it may restart the process of fermentation, which would make it chametz, right? That's a custom, right? So for sure we don't do that. But even for those who might make their matzah wet, right? The custom is not to do that, right? This is not the halacha, right? But as we've learned previously, Rambam's opinion is, it's not an opinion. It's a perspective of Torah, right? Ravid disagrees with him. Others disagree with him. The halacha is not according to the Rambam. But it's still a perspective that we need to understand.
There
Okay?
was a time that people were doing that.
So not so clear.
Okay.
It's not so clear. It seems from the Rambam, yes.
Okay.
Right? It seems from the Rambam. But, we're talking about 900 years ago. So to base it just on halacha, what the halacha is, does that mean that everybody did it? Was it only in a region that they did it? Was the Rambam just, saying that this is a halacha and whatever? And, there was other opinions at the time also. Maybe, he felt that this is what should be done. And yet the halacha, the other sages said no, right? As the Ravid is a contemporary of the Rambam. Actually came a little later, but okay. So we need to understand what's his argument all about, and especially, the Rambam, and thinking that these two things should be able to come together. How? Okay. So again, Rabbi Avram, Shinativ matzah into charoisis. My Rambam says we're obligated to dip matzah into charoisis. Okay. So to understand this, we're going to understand the concept of what contrast is. Right? When you have a picture, or you're taking a picture, or you're painting a picture, right? When you control light and darkness, you shape the way the image is perceived, right? If you have strong light on something, it's going to pick up on particulars, and then you could see much more contrast. If you have less light, you're not going to pick up on the contrast as much, right? So the same idea is here. When you want to speak about liberation, true freedom, how are you going to appreciate and understand it? By its contrast, right? Being incarcerated, being imprisoned, then you'll truly appreciate. Someone who's been in prison and comes out of prison, they, appreciate being free more than someone who just knows of their freedom and never had anything but freedom, right? So when you have contrast in life, then it brings you to truly understand and appreciate something, right? With this, we can understand a similar idea that in the Rambam writes, we begin by declaring that we were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt and describe all the suffering he imposed on us. Then we conclude with the miracles and the wonders performed for us and with our liberation. Why do we set up the Haggadah that way? For the contrast. Okay? Through the contrast, we can appreciate from the severity of suffering how we can relate to the thrill of emancipation. That makes sense? Right? So what's important is the Seder, as we call it Seder night in Canada, right? When I was a kid, I tell this story all the time, so I'm sure you've heard it from me before. When I was a kid, not coming from an observant, very observant home, so of course made the Seder. One night was by my aunt and uncle, and the television was always on because it was always the playoffs in hockey. It was always hockey night in Canada that was conflicting with Seder night in Canada. A big competition, exactly. A big competition. Yeah. So, what's the goal of the Seder? The Seder is supposed to be something experiential. It's not supposed to be something that you're just going through, to get to the food. Although many people, that's what they do. As you know, the story with one guy that one destitute Jew who, things were going better for him because, he got into a good Jewish community and he got invited all the time to homes and, for a meal, a Shabbos meal, in particular. So it was really good. And he had this non-Jewish friend that, so he told him, listen, just tell them you're Jewish. They won't know the difference, So he comes to synagogue, and he gets taken home to, right? And it was Seder night. So next night he asked him, so how'd it go? He said, I don't know, like what you did to me exactly. But, the first thing that they gave me was an onion. So I thought that onion was maybe to just clean my mouth out or something. But then the next piece of food that they gave me was like, I was starving. I was like, they were rambling and saying things. I didn't understand a word they were saying. And finally, at least it was a cup of wine. So I had some wine. It was great. But after that, they gave this cracker that was so dry, you couldn't eat it. And then they gave some vegetables. Okay, a little better, but then they gave the vegetable with the dry cracker. I said, okay, this is enough. I'm leaving. Oh, you fool. If you would have just waited a few more minutes, you would have got the meal. Right? So we're trying to have an experience. The experience isn't the food. Although everything is to be experienced through the food. Not the experience of the food as food, but the food that represents something more. And therefore, what is that more? Liberation. Freedom. That's where we're becoming, right? It's a Zman Cheruseinu, the time of our freedom. And therefore, as we say in the Haggadah, in every generation, we're required to visualize ourselves exiting Egypt. God did not only liberate our ancestors, he liberated us with them. Okay, that's an important, way to experience the evening, the Seder. So, to be truly free to experience it, that's why we have all these various foods, right? Flavors, aromas, awaken the memory. Today, when I came into the house, so Simcha was cooking, my wife was cooking food for the holiday. And I felt the holiday, being surrounded by the aroma of wonderful foods that she makes, which, many people look forward to, which you'll all be tasting. So that now we can understand why we would dip the matzah into charosis, because we're supposed to make this visceral, the experience, right? Eating bitter maror makes the story of the Jewish suffering visceral, right? So why do we spread charosis matzah, the symbol of liberation? Because dipping matzah into charosis creates a contrast that accentuates the relief of liberation from dark exile. As Orach Chaim writes in text number 8, we might suggest that the purpose of dipping matzah into charosis is to remember that God liberated us from bondage, as of mortar as symbolized by the charosis, and granted us freedom as symbolized by the matzah. Okay. Now, although this kind of answers the question, but it's still a little, leaves us a little not complete and appreciative of the concept. Why? It's kind of risky. What's risky? Well, think about it on a personal level. If you went through a trauma in your life, and every year you're going to remember that trauma, right? And yes, you were liberated from it. You got through it. A friend helped, a therapist helped, or the best thing, Tanya helped you, right? That helped, and you got through it. Every year that you would bring it up on the table again and have some foods that represent that trauma, might be risky to do that? To stir up something that you've dealt with, but sometimes we don't always deal with it in a perfect way. We usually don't do it in a perfect way. That by stirring it up again, maybe the fact that I'm liberated from it today might be wonderful, but maybe it's detrimental to do that. Does that make sense? So this is at the heart of the dispute between the Rambam and Rabbi Avram. The Rambam believed that invoking the trauma would be to heighten the sense of redemption. And therefore you have the matzah together with the charosis. Right? Rabbi Avram says, that's a bit reckless. He argues we're in exile today. We still have pain. We don't have complete freedom. Charosis might bring out the trauma, the negativity, and therefore maybe we'll not remember, we won't properly sense the idea of redemption, the sense of liberation. Maybe it doesn't make sense to do that. Right? There's someone that went through October 7th and was kidnapped and spent, 300 days or more incarcerated, and now they're liberated, thank God. But to bring it up could be very hard. Well, where we really sense that, and we really know that, is by who? Holocaust survivors. So many survivors did not speak about their experience. So many, for years. Some of them never did. It was too much of a trauma, what they went through. And we understand, we get that. I don't know if we get it because we didn't go through it, so we don't really get it. Well, at least we respect that. And this is what Rabbi Avram is saying. Don't bring up the trauma, right? In order to contrast it with the freedom and the liberation that you gained. Right? That's their debate. Okay? But let's take this a little deeper, a little more profound. Okay? Because the truth is, as the Jewish people, did we not have a lot more trauma than just Egypt? We have the trauma of the Babylonians. We have the trauma of the Persians that came after them, the Greeks, the Romans, the Almohads, the Christians, the Bolsheviks, the communists, the Nazis, and now we have the Islamists. So, as a Jewish people, we've gone through a lot of trauma, not just Egypt, right? So, if we speak about the trauma that we've gone through as a collective, collectively as a people, and it's after going out of Egypt, what's the celebration of going out of Egypt all about? We got freedom? What does that mean? What kind of freedom did we have under the Crusades? What kind of freedom did we have under the Nazis in the extermination camp? What kind of freedom do we have, right? So how does the celebration of Pesach, okay, it was the first time we were free and we were liberated. But we were incarcerated again. We went through a lot. Why aren't we celebrating them as liberations? What is it about Pesach? And yet, why are we even celebrating the Pesach if in now we're not really liberated? So the answer is there's something unique that happened at going out of Egypt. That happened one time, and that was it. And that's what defines our freedom. It's a unique sense of freedom. Webster's dictionary of freedom means freedom of religion. Well, in Dachau, you didn't have freedom of religion, right? Freedom of speech, freedom of movement, right? When we lived in the ghettos, we didn't really have much freedom of movement, Okay, not completely, right? Maybe we had some freedom of religion. Yeah, freedom of speech, not really. Yeah, in your house, you have freedom of speech, right? But if you went into the market with non-Jews, you weren't free to say what you wanted to say about their value system and their beliefs. You weren't free. I mean, today I am, but right? You weren't free. So what is freedom? Is it only now that we have some freedom? No, we never had it. So we need to refine or redefine what freedom is. And the Maharal from Prague, he helps us with this. Oops. When Jews exited Egypt, they became recipients of intrinsic godliness and therefore remain forever free. Jews are inherently free because they are intrinsically holy. Circumstantial factors cannot undo inherent truths. Even when Jews are under circumstantial subjugation, they are inherently free. Wow. This is a core, essential idea. This explains why the Seder we celebrated today. Because the freedom that we got was a one-time thing that made us forever free, right? In Egypt, we weren't just subjugated physically. We were also subjugated by our inner core. And that's why 80% of the Jews didn't leave, right? Because, they were subjugated by Egyptian culture, not just by the bondage, but they were subjugated by Egyptian culture to such a degree that they abandoned Jewish values and the Jewish way of life. Their hearts and souls, together with their limbs, were in bondage. That was in Egypt, but that's the last time it ever happened. But when God took us out of Egypt, he put a piece of himself, the Jewish soul, in us. Well, God can never become imprisoned, so a Jew can never become imprisoned. What part of the Jew can't become imprisoned? His soul, right? That's Jewish soul is inherently free. Our bodies can be imprisoned. They can be in exile. They can be persecuted. Our bodies could even be killed. But our souls, no, never. That can never happen. No one can touch them. So, which means everything that happens is only circumstantial, right? Is only the circumstance that I'm living through, but it doesn't define me, that circumstance. It doesn't control me. Because me and my soul, I'm beyond it. Wow. This idea is powerfully expressed. Right, so this, right? After exodus from Egypt, we received our Jewish souls. Jewish souls always remain free, no matter what our outside circumstance is. So the previous Rebbe taught us that our souls can never be imprisoned. He worked feverishly for 7 years as the leader of the Chabad movement after his father passed away in 1920. And in 1927, he was finally incarcerated by the Soviets because of terrible things like underground schools, underground synagogues, to keep the embers of Jewish life alive in the Soviet Union. Originally, in his arrest, he had the death sentence. It was commuted to the Gulag, where he would do time in servitude. And as he stood on the train platform in Leningrad, departing for exile, he addressed a crowd that came to say goodbye to him. And he said the following: every nation on earth must know that only our bodies were subjugated to exile and the control of other countries. Our souls, however, have never driven into exile. We're never driven into exile, and never subjugated to the power of others. We must declare openly for all to know that concerning our religion, Torah mitzvahs, and Jewish customs, we have no overlords. No method of compulsion can be effective against us. We must declare with our powerful, intense Jewish intransigence, backed by the thousands of years of Jewish self-sacrifice, touch not my anointed ones and prosecute not my prophets. Very powerful. Right. These are the words that he shared, again, on the platform while he was going to the Gulag for a sentence of 3 years. Then 9 days later, he was released from prison. Right? So, this is unique. Unlike the bondage in Egypt, where we were controlled, not just physically, but spiritually, by our environment, by the evil Egyptians around us. Now, that can never happen. Right? Why? Because we're inherently free. What does it mean, inherently free? I'm free to be who I am. I'm free to act as I choose as a Jew, to believe what I believe, and to follow that which I believe. And that cannot be corrupted. In Egypt, it was corrupted. And that's why the exile was so important. And that's why, what do you have to eat matzah for? You know why we have to eat matzah? Why is matzah liberation? Why is it liberation? because we were so close to the point of no return of being affected by our environment in Egypt spiritually that we had to run out of Egypt. We had to leave quickly. That's why the dove didn't rise and we eat matzah, right? Just tell my son that. Oh, this is so nice. But in the middle of a wonderful class over here about Pesach, I can't see you guys.
Well, you could. Yeah.
Where is
I
you?
can't see.
No, you see me? You don't have it on.
I do.
Okay, I see you. Ah,
Oh, you see me.
oh, look at those cute little girls. Big
I have
girls.
a message for you. They say hi.
Hello.
Okay.
Okay,
bye,
well,
baby.
we'll speak. Well, yeah. Yeah? Okay. I'll call you too.
Yeah, I love it.
Okay.
Bye.
Thank you for calling.
Bye.
Nice.
L'chaim. Okay, where were we?
We have to run fast from Egypt. Because
Right. Why do we have to run fast?
Because we're down 49th level of impurity.
Because we were so close to a point of no return, right? So close to a point of no return that we had to leave Egypt in a hurry. The dove didn't rise. And that's why we matzah. Why is matzah liberation? What's the liberation about matzah? Because we had to leave so quickly. So that represents the leaving, because if we didn't leave then, we would never be free. And we say that in the Haggadah. Just give me 1 second. If we say we have to, we say in sorry, 1 second. Right, exactly. We had the brief open door. We had to escape. Once we escape, then God imbued us with something intrinsic in who we are, a Jewish soul. And that Jewish soul can never be incarcerated.
And did that happen at Sinai?
That happened at Sinai, exactly. And that happened at Sinai. And that Jewish soul can never be incarcerated. Right.
Did that happen at Sinai?
Exactly. Happened at Sinai. Exactly. And that happened at Sinai. And that Jewish soul can never be incarcerated. Right.
Did that happen at Sinai?
Exactly. Happened at Sinai. Exactly. And that happened at Sinai. And that Jewish soul can never be incarcerated. Right.
Did that happen at Sinai?
Exactly. Happened at Sinai. Exactly. And that happened at Sinai. And that Jewish soul can never be. Okay. Finally found.
We're stuck in the past.
That was cute. How do you get a loop like that exactly? How does that happen?
Hashem, so this message we really need to let it
Yeah.
sink in. That was
Hear it a
very
few times.
important.
I guess so. So, the previous Rebbe said, so have to know, declare openly to know, all to know that concerning our religion, Torah mitzvahs, and Jewish custom, we have no overlords. No method of compulsion can be effective against us. We must declare with our powerful, intense Jewish transigence, backed by the thousands of years of Jewish self-sacrifice, touch not my anointed ones and persecute not my prophets. Wow. The message is clear. In Egypt, we could have been beaten down, therefore we had to leave Egypt very quickly, right? But after that, we can never be beaten down. We might be physically subjugated, but the spirit will always be intact. Now, what I mean the spirit, obviously a person could be down and out, right? I can have a bad day or feel a loss of hope. Obviously that can happen. We have freedom of choice. But what was created as the reality of the Jew is that we have a tremendous strength and a power that can never be beaten down in our soul. Nothing in exile could, hinder us ultimately in the deepest sense of the word, right? Our bodies, again, can be imprisoned, but our souls remain free. Okay? Now, this is why we place charosis at the Seder plate. Right? The maror represents the Egyptians' subjugation of our body. The charosis is a metaphor, or it's more than a metaphor, because it's embodied in food, right? The charosis represents the Egypt's hold over our souls, right? And in the end, what they did with it, literally, with the, for mortar, from children, right? So they were able to break us as a result. Says the Maharal, the hard labor that he imposed on us was bitter, but it was not entirely unbearable. The mortar was a breaking point. Nothing was harsher than the mortar episode. This is why we place a symbol of the mortar on the Seder table. So what are we saying when we place it on the Seder plate now? Remember, it's on the Seder plate we're talking about now, right? Not talking about with the matzah. Two separate things. Charosis is on the Seder plate. Question of with the matzah we'll get to. But why is it on the Seder plate? How come? The Seder plate are of all the things about our liberation. How's this our liberation? Because we're not going to be ever in bondage in our soul. Right? The charosis represents the bondage of the soul of the Jew in Egypt. After Egypt, today, that's no longer in bondage. So it's on the Seder plate. Right? That power that Egypt had, or any nation thereafter, is gone. That can never happen again, that horror. I don't mean just the horror of what they did with children. The horror of being subjugated in your soul, in your very being. That can never happen again, right? Does that make sense? So what it really means, because we're inherently free, what does it mean by definition? So there's a beautiful story. I mean, I don't know if beautiful stories are right, but a very powerful story, better than beautiful. As a father and son were in a camp. I don't remember which camp it was. A Nazi camp. And it was Pesach. They were observant, and they made a Pesach Seder together. They got some water that they used for the 4 cups of wine, right? Matzah they didn't have. I don't remember the details of what they had, but they celebrated. So, there's the 4 questions the child asks, right? The child asks another question, Father, Are we going to get out of this and be able to celebrate together in freedom Passover next year? Ooh, imagine a child asking you that, in such a predicament, and like, what do you say? So, I mean, so he says, son, I don't know for certain. I pray and hope that we will get out of this, you and I, so we will have Passover together. But I don't know for certain. But there is something I am certain, that next Pesach, there will be Jews who will be celebrating Passover. There's no question about that. You've heard the story before of in the year 2000, the January 1st edition of the New York Times. So the New York Times did an edition of that was the year 2000 of the year 2100, 100 years from then. And they put news like, what's the world going to look like? What's going to be? They put I don't remember the details of what's on the front page of, in 2100. But in the, I think it's the top right-hand corner, if I recall correctly, they put their Shabbos times for lighting candles. Because the woman Lubavitch, for many, many years, paid to have on the front page, in very small print, in the top corner, the Shabbos times of candle lighting that year. Right? Of that week, right? It was every week, on Friday, in the Friday newspaper. Right? If you remember, Y2K was Friday night, right? It was midnight, was when on Friday night was when the year 2000 came in, right? It was Shabbos. Shabbos, I remember very well. Yeah, we didn't turn into pumpkins, right? So someone found the editor of that page was an Italian, not Jew. I asked him, why did you put that, the other stuff? So he says, listen, everything else that was written on that page, have no idea if that's going to be a reality. But one thing I know for certain, that the Jewish people will be here, and Jewish women are going to be lighting Shabbos candles. So of course I had to go on the front page of the New York Times for the year 2100. Wow. Is that a statement or what? Right? So therefore, Charaisis is there to tell me that trauma, right? That reality of being in bondage in the soul and your very core identity, that's gone, right? That's gone, right? Is that clear? We're not at risk. We're not at risk anymore losing who we are. If you're in Auschwitz, father and son, he knows that next year someone is going to be making a Passover. Say Jews are going to be making it. Whether we will be free to or not, I don't know. Why? Because that's eternal. That's the eternal freedom that we have to be. And since we have the eternal freedom to be who we are, Jews will be observing Passover, lighting Shabbos candles in the year 2100, and so on. Right? Is that clear? So to have it on the Seder plate is one thing, because it stands for itself, right? It stands for itself. And it stands for itself as a sign that bondage is gone. And with that, we can also appreciate the sweetness of it, right? That mortar, that terrible subjugation of the soul is now the sweetness of our soul, because we're never going to be subjugated again. But now the question is to eat it together with matzah. That's a different point, right? That's a different point. Because matzah represents the freedom from intrinsic bondage, right? It symbolizes a full circumstantial freedom. What does it mean, circumstantial freedom? Did the previous Rebbe have circumstantial freedom? No, he was imprisoned. Right? Intrinsic freedom he had, and that's what he spoke about. But circumstantial freedom he didn't have. He was incarcerated. Right? That's something else. Again, the symbol of charosis is now sweet because we have intrinsic freedom. Right? We have intrinsic freedom. But to mix the charosis with the matzah, that it itself also is intrinsic freedom, right? Is representing the pain and the suffering that we went through. Meaning, Sorry, I back up a second. Let me make a distinction here. I don't think I said this clearly. Matzah represents complete freedom. Inherent freedom, circumstantial freedom, both. Charosis only represents the inherent freedom now. I mean, it represents the pain and the suffering we have, but the fact that we have it there is that we're free of the intrinsic subjugation. Is that clear? So now let's go to the story with the matzah with the charosis. So matzah represents complete freedom. Do we have that complete freedom today? No, we don't. That's complete freedom times the Mashiach, right? Dipping matzah then with charosis is a question. So Rambam says, well, that even if we're not fully free, we're free in essence, therefore it's worth celebrating. Right? Right? Even though we're not fully free today, the fact that we're inherently free, that's something we should celebrate. Right? Therefore, dip the matzah in the charosis. Rabbi Avrama disagrees. He says, freedom, he argues, is indivisible. Cannot, if we're not fully free, highlighting only a partial freedom could backfire. Because charosis is only partial freedom, right? It's only inherent freedom. But that could backfire. I was having this discussion on Shabbos, or no, I think it was Friday by the Minyan, with Daniel. He says, you see there's miracles going on in Israel today, unbelievable miracles. Those flying jets going into Iran and bombing, Hashem, every single one's come back. Every single one's come back. Okay, there's miracles that, should be a lot of deaths from what's happened. It's not. But then you could say, you know what, keep your miracle. Who needs the missiles? Right? Right? There's still missiles coming and there's destruction. There is mass destruction. I mean, there is destruction from the missiles coming in from Hezbollah and from Iran. So, on the one hand, there's miracles. On the other hand, there's destruction. When you put the two together, for some, you're going to have a difference of opinion. Okay, obviously we want to have it all. We want a Mashiach, of course. But the question is, if you divide it, if you have the miracle and destruction, right? So what would happen? What are you going to focus in on? And that's the argument over here. Rambam says, even if you don't have the complete freedom, right? Let's call it in the terms of what's going on now in the Middle East, peace. You don't have complete peace, right? The destruction of the enemy and so on, and complete peace. So we're getting to more, peace. Why? Because we're destroying the enemy in such a way that they're not going to be able to wreak havoc, in a truly devastating way, right? Whatever they're doing now is nothing compared to if we didn't destroy them, right? So the question is, like, how do you look at that? Do you look at it as half-baked, as the Rambam is saying, still focusing on the miracles, right? Or is it, is it because there is destruction, there is some death, that therefore, that's pretty traumatic. There's a lot of trauma going on. So, no, don't put the two things together, right? Don't put the two things together. Not so simple, right? Not so simple. So let's see what the Rebbe says over here. Okay, so first, again, let's make sure we have clarity here. By dipping the matzah into charesis, we affirm that even if we're not fully free, we're free in essence. That is what we celebrate on Seder night. Avram says we're not fully free. Highlighting partial freedom can backfire and cause Jews to focus on what we're lacking. So don't focus in on that, right? In other words, what's going on in Israel now, there's people not focusing on the miracles, focusing on the destruction, right? And you have both things going on in Israel right now. This is the debate over here, right? So Rebbe explains like this. Based on the above, we can explain the dispute between Maimonides and Rabbi about dipping matzah into charesis and the distinction between the era of the temple and the era of exile. When the temple stood, it was possible to entirely fulfill the commandment to remember being enslaved in Egypt and going free because we were still free. We could remember that you were enslaved as if as we were ourselves enslaved and then granted our freedom. Therefore, all agreed that it was appropriate to dip the matzah in charesis to demonstrate that God took us out from slavery to freedom. Because at the times of the temple, we were free, right? However, today, now that we're in exile, we can't fulfill it in its entirety, the commandment to remember that you were enslaved and liberated, because we're no longer free. Therefore, the question is whether it is possible to fulfill it in part. Can we celebrate being redeemed from the unique intrinsic subjugation in Egypt, since we are still free of intrinsic subjugation, despite being back in a circumstantial subjugation, as we explained above, right? The two different types of subjugation. Maimonides believes it's possible to fulfill the commandment in part. He therefore rules that we dip matzah into charesis to celebrate that we were liberated from intrinsic mortar subjugation symbolized by the charesis, though we remain in circumstantial subjugation, right? He says, Rabbi Avram disagreed and held that freedom can't be parsed. We are either free or not. Accordingly, although we tell the story of the Exodus in detail, we nevertheless can't fulfill it in its entirety, the commandment to remember that you were enslaved and you went free while we are back in circumstantial subjugation. So if you're capable of seeing intrinsic freedom and appreciating it, then you're able to deal with the fact that you're subjugated circumstantially, and you're not, and that doesn't affect you, right? But the halacha isn't according to the Rambam. Jewish tradition side with Rabbi Avram that we don't dip the matzah into charosis, right? We only eat the charosis later. And when do we eat it? Together with the maror, because that's the full strength of the bitterness, right? When you have those two things together. Yeah. And I still have some questions in my head. I'm just formulating. Okay, let's make sure we got that we have some clarity over here. So, charesis we have on the Seder plate. It's got like a dual meaning to it, right? It means the mortar, which means the subjugation of our soul. So it does reflect something horrific, something very bitter, right? But it's a bitterness of the past. So we remember the bitterness of the past, right? And therefore we have it together with the maror. At the same time, it's a bitterness only of the past, because we're no longer subjugated intrinsically. And therefore, it's part of the Seder plate. The Seder plate is holy. The Seder plate is 3 matzahs, Chachma, Bina, V'das, Chabad, and then 6 items, which are the 6 emotions, Chesed, Gvura, Tiferes, Netzach, Yesod, Malchus, Yesod, and I think the Seder plate itself is Malchus, the 10 divine attributes. So everything on there is holy. The charesis, in the end, and even the bitter herbs, have this holy component to it. Yes, it's remembering something horrific and bitter and painful. But on the Seder plate, how does the maror fit in with that? I don't know. Figure that out. Okay. I have fully developed in my head yet. But okay, in any case, but the charesis represents subjugation of the soul, and therefore it's made into something sweet because that is no longer. So it's like this charesis has like a duality to it, right? It's the mortar, which is a bitterness of the past that it remembers, but it's a sweetness now because it's no longer a subjugation of the Jewish soul. The Jewish soul can never be subjugated. It's inherently free, right? Yet at the same time, we don't dip in the matzah into the charesis. Why? Because matzah means complete liberation, right? That's why matzah is also just water and flour, which is complete bittul. It doesn't rise. It's complete self-effacement, right? Which is complete liberation. Represents complete liberation of the person in the humility, right? And the bittul of the person. That's the complete completion of the individual, complete freedom of the individual. That's what it represents in the person, right? The opposite, the opposite of what freedom means in Webster. Freedom in Webster means freedom of movement, freedom of speech. Here, freedom is freedom to be your true inner self, right? That's true freedom. That's what their matzah represents, right? We can't have that fully today because we're in exile, because there is subjugation on some level. Therefore, the argument is, can you put together the charesis with that, which is only a partial freedom, right, or not? That's the question. That's the debate between Rabbi Avram and the Rambam. So Webster's definition of freedom is not a real freedom, because freedom of movement is circumstantial. And that something can always be taken away from you, as was taken away from Jews, and not just Jews. The communists took that away from anybody who dissented, right? Even today, in free countries, do you have real freedom? Freedom is not freedom of movement. Freedom is freedom to be you. It's for the Jew to be the Jew. That can never be taken away from the Jew. And what they believe, and what they pray to, what they pray for, and how they think, how they feel. Now, sometimes circumstantial, that can be taken away from you, because it might take away your, in prison, take away your tefillin, right? Or whatever. But true freedom is freedom to be. You're not free. You're free from being subjugated. That you could be you. That's the definition of Jewish freedom. All right. So any questions? Any comments? All right. Thank you very much, folks. Huh?
There were lots of big words in it. I'll have to sleep on that. It was good.
Yeah.